Montana Territory, 1887. The wind carried grit off the dry ground as the auctioneer's voice cracked over the crowd. $40, he barked, for a good cook, quiet temper, and strong hands. $40, gentlemen. She is 32, but still got use in her. Glenna Kade stood straight, chin up, hands folded at her waist. The sun beat down on the line of women and girls behind her, all up for sale like cattle. Around her, the crowd of men shifted and whispered, most of them eyeing the younger ones. Glenna's dark brown hair was braided back, streaked with early silver. Her dress was faded but clean. Her boots were cracked, but they still held her steady. "Too old," someone muttered. The words stung, but she kept her face still. She did not cry. She had done her crying the night her husband died 2 years back, and again when his cousins claimed the land and left her and her 2 children with nothing. Then came the sickness last spring. Her boy, Thomas, just 7, passed in her arms. Little Tessa, only 5, followed 6 weeks later. Fever took them both in the night, and the silence afterward nearly drove her mad. Now she was here, sold by the woman who ran the boarding house where she had scrubbed floors to pay for bread she could not swallow. $30. The auctioneer tried again. She can still birth. No husband. No debt, just needs a roof. In the last row, beneath the shade of a wide hat, a tall cowboy leaned on the rail. His arms were crossed, a dusty coat hanging from one shoulder and a thick rope looped at his hip. He had not spoken all auction. His eyes, sharp and unreadable, stayed on Glenna. $25, someone called, laughing. For the mule, not the woman. Glenna flinched, but only a little. The crowd chuckled. The auctioneer looked ready to shove her aside. The cowboy stepped forward and raised one hand. $50, he said. The laughter stopped. The auctioneer blinked. "What was that, sir?" I said. $50, the cowboy answered. His voice was deep and certain. He walked to the front, dropping the coins into the man's outstretched hand. "She is mine now," the auctioneer nodded, stunned. "She is yours." Glenna stared at the man as he approached. He was in his 30s, maybe early 40s, tall and solid, skin darkened from years outside, with eyes the color of stormwood. His jaw was square and unshaven, and his face held no cruelty. He stopped in front of her. "I am not buying a servant," he said. "Name's Xander Cole. I have land. I need a wife. If you want to walk, I will not stop you. But if you want peace, food, and no one looking at you like you are broken, come with me. I will never raise a hand to you." Glenna's voice was calm, but her hands trembled. "You do not want a younger girl." "I saw a woman," he said. "Not a girl, I want a wife." She blinked fast, but gave no tears. She nodded once. "Then I will come." He nodded back and helped her down from the platform. They rode out that evening, his horse pulling a small wagon behind. He gave her space and silence, only speaking when she asked something. By the time the mountains turned purple behind them, she had learned he had no family left, just a cabin and 100 acres up near the Musselshell River. He had run cattle before winter, and the grass was good. No one came out that way unless they meant to. He cooked beans at the fire and handed her the first plate. "Eat first," he said. "Talk later." She did. The food was simple but warm. They sat in quiet, the fire snapping between them. Glenna tried to speak, but her throat caught. She had not sat this close to kindness in a long time. "I had 2 children, she said at last. "They are gone." Xander looked at her, nodded slowly. "I saw that in your face." She looked down at her boots. "I do not cry anymore. You do not have to," he said. The next day they reached his land. The cabin was small but strong, shingled with care. There was a barn, a fence in progress, and a river close enough to hear. It was quiet there, honest quiet. He showed her inside. "1 bed," he said. "I will sleep on the floor." She touched his arm. "You do not have to." He looked at her, eyes steady. "I will wait." "You do not owe me anything." She nodded, but her hand stayed on his arm just a little longer than needed. That night she stood on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, staring out at the stars. Xander stepped beside her. "Why did you buy me?" she asked. "I did not buy you," he said. "I saw a woman left behind too many times. I figured it was time someone stood beside her." Glenna's voice almost broke. "I was sold like a mule." He turned to her, voice low. "And I carried you away like a wife." He paused. "If you will let me." She looked up at him. The stars reflected in her eyes. "I will." They stood there a long time, shoulder to shoulder, the night around them soft and still. The days settled into a quiet rhythm marked by wood smoke and the soft creak of saddle leather. Glenna rose before the sun, tying back her hair in the dim light and stepping barefoot onto the pine floor. The cabin held the smell of dried mint and ashes. She lit the stove, fed the fire, and started the bread with careful hands. Xander had already gone out to check the fence line. He always left before first light, but his coat hung on its peg and his coffee cup waited clean on the shelf. He never locked the door. She found her way through the work without asking. The garden, though small, had been turned over and left half-planted. She spent the morning thinning rows and working in carrots. There was a rhythm in it, the scrape of the hoe. The shift of earth and the ache that came was honest, not the kind that settled in her chest and stayed there. By noon, Xander returned with wire slung over one shoulder and dust on his jaw. He didn't speak much, just nodded once when she handed him a tin cup of water. He drank standing by the porch rail, eyes scanning the sky like he was reading something there. "You build this place yourself?" she asked, wiping her hands on her apron. He glanced at the roof. "Took 5 years. Started with tar paper and a cot. Rest came after the cattle." "You don't strike me as a man who likes being still." "I don't," he said, then quieter, "but I like not being watched." She understood that. It hung between them, unspoken what it meant to be looked at and seen wrong. That night she found a book on the shelf above the hearth. It was a worn volume of Psalms, the leather cracked and softened by use. Inside the front cover, a name had been written in a woman's hand. She traced the ink with her thumb. "Your mother?" she asked, showing him the book. Xander looked up from where he was sharpening a blade along a whetstone. "No, my sister. She was the one who left it with me when she went west. She's still living," he shook his head. "Died in a rail accident near Ogden." Glenna closed the book gently. "I'm sorry. She was the only one who called me by my full name." "What is it, Alexander?" She smiled a little. "It suits you." He met her eyes across the low table. "I like how you say it." They didn't talk more that evening. He returned to his blade and she to the bread she was kneading. But the silence between them was easy, not hollow. The next few days passed with the steadiness of spring thaw. She patched his shirts without asking and mended the hem of the curtain that caught every breeze. In return, he brought in a fresh-cut bundle of pine for the stove and tacked the loose shutter back into place. Once, she caught him watching her from the doorway while she hung linens. He didn't look away when she noticed. He just nodded once, like he was content with what he saw. One morning, as she was wringing out cloths by the creek, he rode up slow and dismounted. "Got a question for you," he said, tying his horse to a branch. She looked up from the water, hands dripping. "Ask it then." "I've got a neighbor, Lyle Hammond, about 10 miles south. He and his wife just had twins. They'll need help for a week or two. I told him I'd ask if you'd ride down with me tomorrow." "You want me to help his wife?" "I want you to meet someone who's kind, and I figured you might want to see another woman." Glenna stood, drying her hands on her skirt. "What's her name?" "Elsie." She gave a small nod. "I'll come." He smiled, not wide, not eager, but quiet and sure, and turned back toward his horse. "Thank you for asking," she said before he mounted. He paused, one boot in the stirrup. "You're not mine to command, Glenna." She watched him ride away, his back straight, his shadow long across the grass. For the first time in years, she felt the stirrings of something steady beneath her ribs, not fear, not duty, just the slow, sure warmth of being seen. The trail south followed a shallow rise along the foothills, where the wind carried the scent of damp sage and last year's grass. Glenna rode beside Xander on a borrowed mare, her skirt pinned high enough to keep from tangling. Neither of them spoke much, but it wasn't silence built from strain. It was the kind that settled between two people who didn't feel the need to fill space with noise. At midday, they passed a patch of burned cottonwoods, their trunks split and hollowed by old lightning. Xander reined in and pointed toward a narrow draw in the land where a small spring pooled clear against the rocks. "We'll water the horses here," he said. As she dismounted, her legs stiff from the ride, she glanced at the trees. "That fire must have come through years ago, 4 winters back," he said, tying his reins to a low branch. "Froze so hard that season the flames moved slow." She knelt by the water, dipping her hands in. The chill bit her skin, but she didn't draw back. "I sometimes think I froze over too." "After my children were gone." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he crouched and filled the horses' canteens, moving with the kind of care that didn't ask for thanks. "When I buried my sister," he said at last, "I didn't speak a word for 3 weeks, not one." Glenna looked at him. The wind lifted strands of hair from her braid. "What changed?" came across a boy caught in a barbed wire snare. He was yelling loud enough to bring down God. I couldn't ignore that. He stood and met her gaze. "Sometimes it takes pain outside your own to wake you up." She rose slowly, brushing dust from her palms. "Maybe that's what you've been for me." His eyes didn't shift. "I'm not looking to fix you, Glenna." "I know," she said. "That's why I trust you." The Hammonds' homestead came into view just as the sun bent low behind the hills. Smoke curled from the stovepipe, and the cry of a baby reached them before they dismounted. Elsie Hammond met them at the gate, her apron damp and hair tucked under a kerchief. She looked young, but her eyes carried the same quiet tiredness Glenna had seen in her own reflection. "You must be Glenna," Elsie said, gripping her hand firmly. "God bless you for coming." Inside, the cabin was warm but cluttered, with 2 cradles side by side on the floor and a pan of beans bubbling on the hearth. Glenna rolled her sleeves up before she even sat down. "Don't worry about introductions," she said, already lifting one of the crying infants. "I know what needs doing." Xander watched from the doorway for a moment, then stepped back outside. The sound of hammering drifted in soon after he'd spotted a loose shutter and started mending it without being asked. That night, Glenna settled both babies while Elsie leaned against the counter, eyes rimmed red with fatigue. "Xander's quiet," Elsie said, not looking up. "He is," Glenna replied, "but he's never cold." Elsie nodded. "That's rare." They didn't speak further on it. Some things didn't need stretching thin with words. By the time the first rooster crowed the next morning, Glenna had already fed the twins and folded every clean cloth on the shelf. When Xander stepped inside with clean water, he paused, eyes flicking to her hands as she kneaded dough on the table. "You ready?" he asked. She wiped her fingers clean. "Yes." Elsie hugged her tightly at the gate. "You're welcome here anytime." As they rode back north, Glenna said, "You were right. I needed to see another face." Xander looked toward the horizon. "You're better with people than you think." "I used to be," she said, "before everything got taken." He didn't speak, but his hand reached across, resting lightly over hers where it held the reins. She didn't pull away. Later, as the cabin came back into view, she noticed the porch step had been reinforced and the window latch tightened. Xander had worked on the place while she'd been gone. She turned to him. "You always fix things when no one's looking?" "Only what's mine," he said. She stepped down, her feet hitting the earth soft. "And what am I?" He met her eyes, slow and steady. "I think you're someone I'd never undo." That night, Glenna didn't take her usual place near the hearth. She stood by the bed instead, fingers resting at the collar of her dress. "You said you'd wait," she murmured. "I did," he said, rising slowly from the floor. She looked at him fully then, not as a stranger or a rescuer, but as a man who had chosen her when no one else had even looked. "I'm not asking you to." He stepped toward her, and for the first time she leaned into him before he touched her. There was no rush in it, no hunger, just steadiness, like warmth rising from deep ground. When morning came, the bed was tangled and the fire had burned low, but Glenna woke with her cheek against his shoulder, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel alone in the world. The calving began before dawn. Glenna woke to the sound of the barn door creaking and the low, strained groan of a cow in labor. She sat up, the chill of early spring seeping through the chinks in the log wall. The bed beside her was already empty, still warm where Xander had lain. She dressed quickly, pulling on her shawl and boots, then stepped outside into the gray hush of morning. The sky was heavy with low clouds, and the air smelled of damp earth and new grass. She crossed the yard without hesitation, skirts tucked up, boots sinking slightly into the soft ground. Inside the barn, Xander stood beside a heifer on her side, straw matted beneath her. His sleeves were rolled past the elbow, hands slick with effort, jaw tight with focus. He looked up only briefly when Glenna entered. "She's struggling," he said. "Calf's turned wrong." Glenna nodded once and moved to the other side of the cow. "You have a cloth." He handed her one from a bucket nearby. She knelt, steadying the cow's shoulder with one hand and placing the other on the warm, taut belly. Her voice stayed low as she worked. "Push when I tell you," she said to the cow, not expecting understanding but offering steadiness anyway. Together, they worked until the sun broke faintly through the clouds. When the calf finally slid free, slick and shivering, Xander caught it. Glenna wiped its nose and mouth clean, then rubbed its sides until the first shaky breath came. Xander leaned back on his heels, exhaling hard. "That's 3 in 2 days. I'm starting to think they planned it." Glenna smiled faintly, her hands red from cold water and effort. "They're just waiting for the ground to soften." Later, after the calf had found its legs and the cow licked it clean, they returned to the cabin. Glenna stoked the stove while Xander washed up at the basin. She handed him a towel without asking. He dried his hands, then leaned against the counter, watching her crack eggs into a pan. "I've been thinking about building a smokehouse," he said. "There's a stand of cedar north of the ridge." She stirred the eggs slowly. "You planning to salt the meat or hang it sweet?" "Both. Depends what we catch come summer." She turned to him, wiping her hands on her apron. "You're not used to asking opinions. I'm not used to needing them." She stepped closer, voice soft. "You have them now." He looked down at her, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. "You ever think about trying again, with children?" she asked. He nodded once. She didn't answer right away. The pan hissed behind her. "That kind of loss changes how you carry hope. I'd never ask for what you can't give." She touched his chest lightly. "I'd give it if it came. But I'd need to know it was joy, not expectation." "It would be," he said. "Only if it was joy." She nodded, and they stood there in the stillness, the smell of wood smoke curling between them. A week later, they rode to the trading post. Supplies were low, and the spring rains had made the trails soft and slow. Glenna rode beside him, a burlap list tucked in her pocket. She hadn't been into town since before the sale, and her hands tightened slightly on the reins as the low roofs came into view. Xander noticed. "You don't have to go in." "I do," she said. "It's different now." The store was busy, men and women haggling over seed and sugar. Glenna moved through the narrow aisles without hesitation. She picked out soap, flour, needles, and a small tin of coffee. At the counter, a woman with gray-streaked hair looked her over. "You're with that Cole fellow," she said. "Thought he'd never settle." Glenna met her eyes. "He didn't settle, he chose." The woman blinked, then rang up her purchases without another word. Outside, Xander was tying 2 sacks behind his saddle. "All quiet in there?" he asked. She handed him the coffee. "Mostly." They rode home slow, the sun low behind them, casting long shadows across the grass. Halfway back, Glenna reached across the space between their horses and took his hand, just for a breath. He looked over, surprised. "You all right?" "I'm more than all right," she said. "I'm not afraid anymore." He didn't speak after that, but he didn't let go either. That night, they sat on the porch with a blanket across their laps, the stars sharp above them. Glenna leaned into his side, her head against his shoulder. "I didn't think I'd have a second life," she said. "You didn't," Xander answered. "You had one life. This is just the part where it gets to be yours." She turned her face into his shirt, breathing in the scent of cedar and hide, and for the first time in years, her heart rested without weight. By late May, the land had softened under the steady coaxing of sun and meltwater. The fields near the river had turned a deep, damp green, and the cottonwood branches bent under new leaf. Glenna stood at the edge of the garden with her bare feet sunk in the soil. A breeze moved through her skirt, and the smell of tilled earth clung to her skin. She had just finished planting the last row of beans, hands dark with loam, nails rimmed with dirt. Her back ached in a way that reminded her she was alive. Xander was working near the shed, sawing cedar boards with slow, deliberate strokes. The smokehouse was half-framed now, the posts sunk deep and true. He looked up when he heard her approaching, pausing just long enough to brush sawdust from his shirt. "You finished?" he asked. She nodded, brushing a curl of hair from her neck. "For now. I'll start on the onions tomorrow." He set down the saw. "There's something I want to show you." She followed him without question, stepping into his pace as they crossed the pasture. They passed the north fence, where the ground sloped gently toward a stand of pine. A few wild irises bloomed there, stubborn and blue against the grass. He led her to a small rise where the land opened wide beneath the sky. In the middle of the space was a single young apple tree, its branches just beginning to leaf. A ring of stones circled its base. She stopped. "You planted this," he nodded. "Last year, before I ever saw you." Her voice was quiet. "Why here?" "I figured someday I'd want to sit under it with someone who'd understand what it meant to start over." She crouched at the base and touched the bark, still smooth and pale. "It'll be years before it bears." "I'm not in a hurry," he said. "I've waited longer for less." When she looked up at him, her eyes were clear and steady. "You don't always say much, but when you do, it stays with me." He knelt beside her, his hands folded over his knee. "I don't know how to do anything halfway, Glenna. I don't speak light. I don't love light." The wind shifted. She reached up and touched his cheek, her fingers trailing the line of his jaw. "Then don't love me light." He leaned into her hand, eyes closing for a breath. "I don't." They stayed there until the sun dipped low behind the trees and the shadows turned long and gold. Back at the cabin, she cooked lentils with dried sage and a piece of the last smoked ham. He brought in water from the well and lit the lantern without being asked. After supper, she reached into a drawer and pulled out a folded piece of linen. She laid it on the table between them. He looked at it, puzzled. "I've been sewing," she said. "It's not much, but I thought we ought to have something that's ours." He unfolded the cloth. It was a small quilt square, hand-stitched, with 2 pine trees and a river winding between them, all in faded thread. A single star was sewn above the taller tree. "I've never had a home that looked like anything," he said. "But this is what it feels like." She smiled. "Then we'll build it from feeling." Rain came that night, soft at first, then steady. They lay in bed together, listening to it tap against the roof. Her head rested on his chest, his arm curled around her back. "Do you ever think of going farther west?" she asked, her voice hushed. "I did once," he said. "Thought I'd keep running till there was no one left to remember me. And now I want to stay so long the land forgets I was ever a stranger." She turned toward him, her fingers splayed across his ribs. "Then we'll stay. And whatever comes next, we'll meet it together." He kissed her then, not like a man hungry, but like a man who had found the thing he thought he'd never be worthy of. She returned it with the same quiet certainty, and nothing in the world felt unfinished. The seasons turned. The smokehouse was finished by summer's height, and they filled it with strips of venison and herbs gathered from the creek's edge. Glenna's garden stretched wider each month, rose neat and proud. The cabin took on signs of permanence. Curtains stitched from old calico, a shelf of jars filled with pickled roots and preserves, a second chair carved to match the first. By autumn, the apple tree had grown another foot. Xander carved their initials into the trunk with a small pocket knife, and Glenna laughed when the bark curled around the letters. In the first frost of October, she told him she was expecting. He had been stacking wood beside the porch when she said it, her voice careful, eyes watching his face for any flicker of fear. But he only stepped forward and took her hands in his, pressing his forehead to hers. "I never thought I'd get to start a family the right way," he said. She smiled. "Neither did I." And when the child came one quiet spring morning a year later, born as the sun slipped over the hills, they named her Elsabeth, after her sister in kind. She grew with her mother's quiet strength and her father's steady eyes. They raised her among the sounds of wind and river, in a house where nothing was ever bought with fear, but built with patience, with hands that knew loss and chose love anyway. And under the apple tree, in the long shade of late afternoon, they sat together often, Glenna, Xander, and their daughter, wrapped in the kind of peace that only comes when every moment has been earned.